Yo guys, what's going on? I'm Tim for The Real Sports Talk. You can find me on Twitter at CashKelly_TRST. We are up to day 20 of our 2012 MLB season previews, and that takes us out to the Los Angeles Angels of Anaheim, the team that made obviously the two biggest splashes of this past offseason by signing Albert Pujols and also signing C.J. Wilson pretty much all on the same day. They came out of nowhere to sign both of those guys, and the new TV deal really allowed them to helped them to be able to do that, along with Albert Pujols backloading his contract. Now, backloading his contract may hurt the Angels in the future, but at the present moment, it allowed them to add another solid arm, and while they had to overpay for that solid arm, it's probably worth it in the end. Let's go through their lineup, and I'll go through their pitching staff and some of their relievers as well. Mike Scioscia, obviously, back as manager again. I think he's, at this point, I believe he is the longest tenured manager in the MLB, and he really is a great manager, so he deserves that. We will start behind the plate with catcher Chris Iannetta, who was acquired this offseason from the Colorado Rockies. Iannetta last year, in 112 games, hit .238 with 14 home runs. He's had some nice years where he's shown a lot of potential. 2008 he came up, hit 18 home runs. It's just always been a matter of staying healthy and not getting enough looks behind the plate that he has not been able to get into a groove. If he can play closer to a full season this year, which he never has really done, I think that this is a guy that will be hitting 7th or 8th in this lineup that will actually get a lot of good pitches, because you're not going to pitch to guys like Pujols and Torrey Hunter, so he'll come up with a lot of guys on base. I think the RBIs will be a lot better this year. I think he'll hit close to 70 RBIs this year and about 18 or 19 home runs. So I expect a breakout season from Chris Iannetta behind the plate this year. Backing him up, you have Bobby Wilson, who last year in 57 games hit 189 with 1 home run. So, for the most part, Bobby Wilson's not a terrible backup, but Chris Iannetta will get most of the looks. And then you have Hank Conger also on the roster last year in 59 games. He hit 209 with 6 home runs. So he brings a little more pop to this team off the bench. And when you're in the American League and you don't need to worry about pinch hitting for the pitchers, you can use that third catcher and actually have him hit. So that is a nice piece, although he probably will not be on the opening day lineup because the Angels just have so much depth, especially in the outfield and over at first base. As we look over to first base, does this guy even need any introduction? The best player in the MLB, Albert Pujols, this year signed a 10-year deal to leave the St. Louis Cardinals, where he had spent his entire career, coming off winning a World Series title, to join the Los Angeles Angels of Anaheim. Last season was actually one of his worst seasons of his career, and get this, this is a guy whose career has a .328 average. One of the worst seasons of his career was .299 with 37 home runs. He did miss about a week of the season because of an injury to his elbow. Ultimately ended up being fine. Didn't have a great playoffs, but in the end, people remember the great performances, and that Game 3 performance where he hit 3 home runs really is going to be what people remember. What Albert Pujols is going to bring to this lineup is just incredible. This is a team that could not hit very well the last few years. That is what has allowed the Rangers to take control of this division. Albert Pujols is going to stabilize this lineup and take a lot of pressure off everyone else. The one thing that I am somewhat worried about is that Albert Pujols you'll take what he gave you last year, but to give this guy a 10-year deal, if he's only hitting .299 now, when his career average is .328, that means that he's somewhat slowing down a little bit. And when you have 10 years left on a deal and his contract is backloaded, meaning more of the money's coming in the back, you could really be screwed. And I think that everyone knows that towards the end of this deal, you're going to be giving this guy a ton of money. And that's the problem with all the guaranteed contracts in the MLB. But that just kind of is what it is, because you're not going to not have guaranteed contracts in the MLB. They just agreed to a new labor deal, and obviously that wasn't even one of the big issues discussed. So Albert Pujols will bring a ton to this lineup for at least the first 5 or 6 years of his contract, and we'll see after that. He's only 32 years old. Some people, including the Florida Marlins, think he's a little older than that, but he's listed as 32 years old. Mark Trumbo will be backing him up, and here's a guy, who really got screwed, because the Angels needed to add someone to the lineup, but they didn't necessarily need to add a first baseman. The problem was this offseason, there really wasn't another guy out there who could really make the Albert Pujols type of impact on your lineup. So they had no choice. You had to either go get Fielder or Pujols. They decided to go get Pujols. But Trumbo has a bright future, whether it is with the Angels or whether it is with somewhere else, because he has such good power. He had 254 last year with 29 home runs and 87 RBIs. This is a guy that almost hit 30 home runs, and he's not even going to be a starter. He's great trade bait if the Angels would need to add another bat to this lineup. And, I mean, he's still very young, so I think ultimately the Angels, he's like 27 years old. I think ultimately the Angels would be best served seeing what happens with a guy like Kendry Morales. Maybe looking at giving him some looks at third base if Alberto Callaspo does not have a good year. And even in the outfield, ultimately, trying to work him there. Because to trade away a 27-year-old who hit 30 home runs in really his first big league season, it doesn't make a ton of sense, and you're probably, because teams know he's expendable, not going to get the type of value he's worth. That's just my thought. Kendry Morales will be the DH. Morales, I mean, he looked very good prior to the last two seasons. He looked, or let's go to 2009, really his first season where he got a ton of playing time. Was hitting .306 with 34 home runs and 108 RBIs. Had a tremendous season that year. The next season came back. He's hitting .290 with 11 home runs. Hits a walk-off home run. Jumps on home plate like everyone else does. Tears his ACL. Then he missed all last season as well. So you really, because of setbacks, you really do not know what you're going to get out of Kendry Morales. And the good thing, even if you would decide to use Morales against righties and Trumbo against lefties, is you have that option. That is what another thing that makes this Angels lineup so deep. Now, you may ultimately decide that you're better served trading Trumbo and Vernon Wells for just a better overall outfielder, or maybe even a third baseman, like if David Wright became available. But at this point, that's a nice thing to have at DH, to have two guys that can really hit. And Kendry Morales will not be a first baseman anymore. He's just going to be settled into that DH role. We'll see how that affects him, because for the most part he had been a first baseman. Howie Kendrick, a guy who I think is one of the most underrated second basemen in the MLB, hit .285 last year with 18 home runs and 63 RBIs in 140 games. You'd like to see him get closer to 162 games. He's never really been that except for 2010 where he played 158 games. So you'd like to see him get closer to that. And what I also like to see out of him is a little more aggressiveness on the base paths, because I think he could steal closer to 20 bases. He's stolen 14 in the last 2 years. Not a great success rate, but I think he's very fast, and potentially that could be, with some of the pressure off guys like him in the lineup and more of it on guys like Pujols, Howie Kendrick can just be that leadoff hitter that gets on, and then if he can steal second base, you're going to have a ton of guys that can just hit you with single, hit you with double, and get him in. Meiser Sturis will be the backup at shortstop and second base, and also will even potentially be a backup over at third base. In 122 games last year, he had .276 with 5 home runs and 38 RBIs. He's not a starter. You see that out of the amount of games he played last year and how low his numbers are. But he's a very nice asset to have on your bench, and he can give you some speed off that bench. He's stolen over 10 bases 3 times in his career, so he gives you that type of guy off the bench. He's a natural third baseman, but they seem to have third base kind of down with Callaspo, and Mark Trumbo, if Callaspo doesn't work out there, would probably be the first guy in line, not because he's probably a better fielder than Sturis, but because of the bat. At shortstop, you have Eric Ibar. Last year, Ibar hit .279 with 10 home runs and 59 RBIs. He's not a great player, but he actually did have a pretty solid season last year, and he's a really, really nice base stealer. Stole 22 bases in 2010 and in 2011. And when I said not a great player, I meant to say hitter. In 2010, he stole 22 bases. Last year, he stole 30 bases and got caught less times than he did in 2010. The average is up. He did it .312 in 2009. So if you can get that Ibar, you could be talking about an all-star. But you'll take the guy you're getting, because, again, in this lineup, to have him hit either probably second or sixth or maybe even leadoff, you got a lot of good guys in the middle of that lineup that are just going to make things easier for an Eric Ibar. Actually, he won't hit sixth. He'll probably hit either first or second or eighth or ninth. But, I mean, this is not a bad guy at eighth to kind of reset things and have a second leadoff position. Alberto Callaspo, as the aforementioned Alberto Callaspo will be the starting third baseman. Last season for the Angels in 141 games, stole 8 bases, hit 288 with 6 home runs and 46 RBIs. Did a really nice job in the field, but not necessarily a great hitter at the plate. I mean, in this lineup where you have a ton of depth, you would like to think that maybe Mark Trumbo is the guy long term here. Callaspo is a left-handed hitter, so maybe that would work. Or no, actually he's a switch hitter, but maybe you bat him against the righties and Trumbo against the lefties until you find a groove. He did hit 300 a couple times earlier in his career, and one of those was actually in like a full season in 2009. Hit 311 home runs and 73 RBIs. So you're getting a good player. The question is, you already have a couple like average type get on base guys in Ibar and Kendrick. Do you want another guy like that, or do you want another power guy like Mark Trumbo to start over at third base when you know the fielding probably is not going to be quite as good? Again, Trumbo's going to get those looks at third base. He's going to get some looks in the outfield, so we will come back to him. Vernon Wells will be your starting left fielder. Came over from Toronto, had a miserable first season last year. He did hit 25 home runs, so I mean, I guess it's tough to call it too miserable. But again, he had trouble staying healthy for the full season, which has kind of been one of his problems. He hit 218 with 25 home runs and 66 RBIs. And when you see these guys at 240 and 250, but still hit like 30 home runs, you say, okay, I'll take it. When you see a guy at 218 and 25 home runs, it's kind of like, you know, the power's nice, but you got to give us a little bit more than that. His base stealing is not as good. His range in the outfield is not as good. Obviously, he was a former center fielder. Now they have him playing left field. So, I like Vernon Wells still as a player, but I mean, I don't think that there's any reason to believe that the average wouldn't come back up, because the 2 seasons he had before that, he hit 260 and 273, and you'll take that, although in 2009, when he hit 260, he only hit 15 home runs, so I mean, and the same amount of RBIs, so which would you rather have? You'd like to get the 2010 season. I think that that's actually a very realistic possibility, again, with a lot of the pressure off him, adding Albert Pujols into this lineup, hitting 273 with 31 home runs and 88 RBIs. We saw what playing with Albert Pujols did to re-energize a guy like Lance Berkman's career, and I think that it could have a similar effect this season on Vernon Wells. Backing him up in left field, you have Bobby Abreu, the veteran, a guy who was once my favorite player. I think that he would start in pretty much any other outfield in the MLB, although his power numbers have kind of gone down the drain, especially last year. You saw that power completely decrease. This was a guy who hit 30 home runs a couple times, used to be good for 25, gradually he's going down to 15, came back up to 20 in 2010, but I think you're asking for a lot if you expect more than 14 home runs this season from Bobby Abreu, especially when he's not getting a ton of playing time. My guess is that Bobby Abreu will be traded before spring training ends, but I do not know that. I think he'll be traded at some point in the season, or maybe even designated for assignment if they cannot find anything else to do. Ultimately, I mean, you got Pete. Well, I'll get to him in a second, but you do have some positions on this team where you're not really sure of. So to just give Bobby Abreu away for nothing doesn't make a ton of sense. But we've heard whispers that he really is not happy at all with the amount of playing time, that he is not going to be okay with just being a fourth outfielder. He's already saying he wants more playing time this spring. And his teammates have really came out and had his back this offseason, saying, look, if I was in his position, I forget who it was, but they tweeted this the other day, if I was in his, I think it was Torrey Hunter, if I was in his position, I had the type of career Bobby Abreu's had, I mean, not a Hall of Fame career, but a really nice career, I would want to start in the later parts of my career, because I don't know how many years I have left. If I'm Bobby Abreu, I say I'll take my looks this season and we'll make a run at the World Series. If we get it, great. If not, I mean, I still got to go find another team this offseason. I think he only signed a 2-year extension, so this should be the final season of his deal anyway. Peter Borges will be in center field, or Borjos, my bad. He will be in center field. Last year in 147 games, he hit 271 and 12 home runs and 43 RBIs. The season before that, in 51 games, he had 204. That's what I'm talking about. That's the way Bobby Abreu gets in this lineup, is either Boros doesn't do well and you move either Hunter or Wells to center and move Abreu to left or right if you don't decide to use Mark Trumbo instead. I mean, that's the problem. Even if one of these guys get injured, you saw Mark Trumbo, you'd probably rather have his bat in the lineup, and In left field, Bobby Abreu's never really been much of a left fielder. He's always been a right fielder throughout his career, so you would think that that would actually be a better situation. Now, he has gotten some looks at left field over the past few years, but I think that Mark Trumbo would actually get a lot more of the looks than Bobby Abreu. So, essentially, Bobby Abreu is screwed because he's not going to be much more than a pinch hitter, and in the American League, in a lineup that has become pretty strong, there's not going to be a ton of pinch hitting opportunities. That's the unfortunate part for Bobby Abreu. Starting right fielder Torrey Hunter. This guy used to be one of the best center fielders overall in the game, not just because of his bat, but because of his fielding ability. If you remember the 2002 All-Star game, him robbing that home run of Barry Bonds, that game was in Milwaukee, one of the best plays in the history of the All-Star game. And I know it's just an All-Star game, but he made a name for himself with those type of plays and with the type of pop he had. Now, he doesn't quite have that same pop, the 30 home run pop that we came accustomed to seeing with him or from him in Minnesota. But in the final season of his contract this year, the final season of a, I believe, 5-year, $90 million deal, you would expect that he wants to have a nice season to enhance his value for free agency this season. I would expect an average around 275 with about 25 home runs, 26. I think his power numbers will go back up a little bit playing in this lineup, and closer to the 90 RBIs that he had in 2009 and 2010 than the 82 RBIs that he had last season. He did miss, and for the most part, for the most part, he has still played close to 162 games every year. He might miss 5 to 10 games, but that's going to happen over the course of a season. And the good thing about having veterans like Abreu on the bench and having a guy like Mark Trumbo is Vernon Wells does not need to go out there 162 games. He can work out of a slump, but you can give him a day off. Torrey Hunter, same thing. Peter Boros does not need to go out there every single day. So they have a lot of options in this lineup. The problem is you don't want to make too many, you don't want to get guys mad, and you don't want to not allow them to get into a groove because you're changing so much. I mean, I've been in situations like that, and if you're in a slump and you're only getting limited playing time, it's really hard to get out of it. So you have to kind of find the right mix there. Their starting rotation has vastly improved this season too, and it wasn't too bad last year either. Jared Weaver, who finished second in AL Cy Young voting, quietly had a year that pretty much any other season would have won him the Cy Young, but we all know what Justin Verlander did last year. Went 18-8, and for much of the season had an ERA under 2. Ended up with a 2.41 ERA last year, made 33 starts, 4 complete games, 2 of those complete game shutouts, threw over 230 innings. You'd like to reduce those innings a little bit this season because you want to save some of those innings for the playoffs, a situation that I think most people expect them to be in. And opponents only hit 212, and he had a 1.01 whip. He's one of the probably borderline top 5 pitchers in the game right now. He's certainly in the top 10, no questions. Dan Herron at the number 2 spot will be overlooked by a lot, but he is one of my Cy Young sleepers because he went 16-10 last year. I think he'll have less losses and more wins this year. And you guys know that I don't take that too seriously, but Cy Young voters do. And I think with less pressure on him in this rotation now, he will be able to reduce that ERA closer to about 310, 307, somewhere in that area. I mean, he's probably not overall a Cy Young winner because people will say, well, I'll take Sabathia or John Lester, one of those guys in the AL East who have a similar record because they're playing harder competition. And, while that's probably true, it would still be very nice if he could get that ERA down a tiny bit. He threw 238 innings. This has been a guy that, since he's been in the MLB, has thrown 200 innings since he's been in the MLB pretty much full time. He's thrown 200 innings every season since 2005. So, quietly, he has had a really nice career. I don't know why it's gone so overlooked. C.J. Wilson took somewhat of a discount, supposedly, to go to Anaheim. I think that they overpaid him and overvalued him. I think if you saw what he did in the playoffs last year, you realize that he had kind of been a product. He had 10 of his 16 wins last year coming within that division. And if you think about the teams that were in the AL West last year, the A's and the Mariners couldn't hit a lick. And then the Angels really were not too good of a hitting team the last 2 seasons where this guy's really broken out as a starter. So I mean, and remember, he was even a closer back in the day. He shared the duties with Frank Francisco, who is now at the Mets. He's become a pretty solid starter, but is he a starter worth close to $70 million? I tend to think not. He threw a career-high innings last year. I'm not taking anything away from him. He's going to be probably one of the best number threes in the game, probably the best behind guys like Madison Bumgarner and Cole Hamels. But I don't know if he's exactly... I really think that they gave him a bad contract. That's what I'm going down to. And I don't know if I trust him in the playoffs still, because I don't think he is an elite pitcher. I think he's a very solid pitcher, but I don't think he's elite. And I think that you have a guy at the number 4 spot who is just as good, if not better, when he's going right in Irvin Santana. Last year, came back, had a really nice season after having 2 seasons where you'll take a 3.92 ERA. That's not terrible, but that's not like a World Series team, which is what he had in 2010, and he just had the worst year of his career probably in 2009, although he had a bad year in 2007 with the 5.03 ERA. Last year, including throwing a no-hitter in 4 complete games, which he will give you a lot of, he went 11-12 with a 3.38 ERA through close to 230 innings. The Angels got a lot of work out of these starters as you listen to the type of innings that they threw last year. Opponents hit 241 off him, and he had a 1.22 whip. Another really solid year out of another Angels starter last year, and you would hope that if he can give you anywhere near that, that is probably the best number 4 starter around. There's not too many number 4 starters who are going to give you an ERA under 3.4 or 5. So a really impressive guy. You hope that you get the good Irvin Santana, not the bad. It's kind of like the Rex Grossman syndrome, only he actually brings a lot more to the table. Irvin Santana, when he's on, is one of the nastiest pitchers in the MLB. When he's off, it can get really ugly. So you got to see, and that's why it is nice that they were able to add a guy like C.J. Wilson. Just the price tag was a little too high for my liking. Jerome Williams will be at the number 5 spot. Williams, a 31-year-old, my bad. He doesn't bring a ton to the table. He went 4-0, 3.68 ERA. I mean, not a terrible pitcher. Started only 6 games last year. Had some relief appearances. Never really been much of a starter throughout his career that's shown you a ton. He had some years with the Giants where he had an ERA above 4, which I really don't believe is too strong. And I believe if you did that in the NL West, what are you going to do in the AL West, which has improved. I mean, the Mariners are getting better. The A's trade away every good player they get. And then you have the Texas Rangers, who are probably the best lineup top to bottom in the MLB. So it's going to be an adjustment for him starting full time. And if things do not work with Jerome Williams, you have Garrett Richards, 0-2 last year with a 5.79 ERA, but he is very young, and there are a lot of expectations. So one thing that is just extremely unfortunate is that you could have had a guy like Nick Adenhart at the back of that rotation, and unfortunately Nick Adenhart was killed in a DUI manslaughter the other year. He was supposed to be really nice. Rest in peace to him. I mean, that was just an awful thing how that whole thing went down. Nick Adenhart would have been a really nice MLB pitcher. From the things I've seen about him, read, and some of the early games that he had pitched in the MLB, it's unfortunate because you could have had an even better rotation than you already do now. As we look at some of the bigger names in their bullpen, we'll start with Jason Isringhouse, that kind of brought his career back the last couple of years. He did decent latching on with the Rays in 09, and then took 2010 off, was not in the MLB. I believe he was in some teams' minor leagues. Came back with the Mets last year, did alright, 3-3, 4.05 ERA, not very impressive, doesn't blow you away. 7-11 in saves. Obviously, everyone knows he formerly had some really nice seasons with the Cardinals. He was always a guy that blew too many saves for your liking, but he got a ton of opportunities too, so that's probably going to happen. Isringhausen is either going to work or he's just going to kind of fizzle out, and I would tend to think it'll be closer to fizzling out, to be quite honest with you. Hishinori Takahashi was acquired from the Mets last year, went 4-3 with a 3.44 ERA in 61 games. The Mets have tried to make him a starter, and he didn't look terrible, but I think that we all know that he is a lefty specialist, a middle relief type guy, and in 68 innings last year, he did a nice job. Opponents hit only 232 against him, and lefties really struggled to hit this guy. Takahashi is one of the more underrated lefty specialists in the game right now. Scott Downs will be the setup man for Jordan Walden. Scott Downs last year went 6-3 with a 1.34 ERA. Just the lights out setup man, really since he's been there, and in his years with Toronto, he was one of the best setup men and relievers in the game. Since 2007, this guy's been one of the best, most underrated relievers out there. So Scott Downs brings a ton, and having another lefty in your bullpen, when you have two really solid lefties in your bullpen, is great for matchups, because you can say, okay, we're at the top or we're at the bottom of this lineup, and they can bring in a lefty pinch hitter. So we're going to bring in Takahashi. And we don't have to worry about next inning in the 8th inning when you got two, you got Curtis Granderson and Robinson Cano coming up, because you can just bring Scott Downs in to face them. You don't have to worry, oh, we can't waste the one lefty on this guy, so we need to forget about the matchup and just save him. You don't need to worry about that, and that is a very nice plus. Jordan Walden will be the closer. This is one of the big questions on this team, and one of the reasons why I am still not 100% convinced that they are the best team in this division. 5-5 last year, 2.98 ERA, got 42 attempts closing and blew 10 of those with 32 saves. I am not sold on what he brings to this team. I know that he has a lot of potential, and he's very young, throws hard. No questions with that, but there's a lot of guys that look very good, have a ton of potential. Jason Mott on the Cardinals was a hot guy the other year, and he's never really become that very good closer that they thought he'd be, although did save the World Series last year, so I guess that's a bad example. Jordan Walden could end up having a really nice season. My guess, though, is that they could use, trade a guy like a Vernon Wells, although his contract's unmanageable. So they could trade a guy like Bobby Abreu, or even if they need to, Mark Trumbo to go, or Kendry Morales to go get a big name closer. If they can add a solid closer to the back of this bullpen, then I am 100% confident that the Angels will win 92 plus games. The problem that they run into is they have another very, very good team in that division that has a better lineup. I think a equally good bullpen. The rotation is not as strong, but I don't think it's as bad as people tend to make it out to be. I think that the Rangers do a very good job of working with pitching. Mike Maddox has done a tremendous job there. Guys like C.J. Wilson, who you never saw coming up, Colby Lewis the other year. So they always seem to kind of have that next answer, and they brought in Yu Darvish. And everyone says, okay, well, even if they don't win the division, you got the 2 wild cards. You can't forget about how good the AL East is, though. You have 3 teams in that division who are probably going to make the playoffs, and the Rays, Yankees, and Red Sox. I mean, people seem to be so down on the Red Sox. I know they choked, but they still won 90-some games, and they had the best record in baseball for quite a decent part of the season. And I really doubt they're going to choke in October again, or September again, and have such an awful start. So you tend to think they're going to make the playoffs, and that leaves you with 1 wild card spot. And I would tend to think that the Rays could make a run at that. The Angels, the Rays, and who knows what comes out of the NL or the AL Central. You tend to think that the Tigers are the only playoff team in that division, but who knows? The Royals on paper look really good, although they could be losing Joakim Soria. I don't think that the Royals are going to make the playoffs, but I'm just saying there's always that one team that comes out of nowhere that people never expect to make the playoffs. So give me your thoughts, what you see happening with this Angels team this year. That is Day 20 MLB preview. Day 21 will feature the Atlanta Braves, a team that struggled down the stretch last year, ultimately giving up the wild card to the future world champion St. Louis Cardinals. Give me your thoughts. Hit me up on Twitter. Like The Real Sports Talk on Facebook. I'll catch you guys later.